Model railroads have been with us since, well, nearly the beginning of railroads. Today we visit one man, Charlie Burns. He's building a model rail of the line between San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara, dubbed the South End, long considered among the most picturesque in the Southern Pacific rail system. It was the very last to be completed, connecting San Francisco and Los Angeles. Perhaps because of this ruggedness and remoteness, the landscape is still recognizable as it was in 1901, over 100 years ago when the line was completed. With timetable in hand, Charlie hopes to have his South End model as it was operating in 1964, one of the busiest times for rail service along the Central Coast. Direct rail service reached San Luis Obispo in 1894. Once real service arrived into San Luis Obispo, the line quickly extended down to the rich farming lands in Guadalupe and Santa Maria. Rail service from Los Angeles reached Santa Barbara in 1887 and shortly extended 11 miles north to Elwood, just 57 miles short of Surf. A decade later, in 1900, the final spike was driven at the Cementerio Bridge trestle, just 23 miles north of Santa Barbara. That very same evening, the first train crossed the trestle, and in the following year, direct scheduled coastline train service between San Francisco and Los Angeles was in full operation. After various improvements and realignments, the current configuration was finished in 1910.
1964 is easier to model for the same reason the railroads abandoned steam engines for diesels. Diesels are easier to maintain. That's the sets and things on them that have to be balanced, and that's just more moving parts that have to be fixed. And they were right between two generations of diesels. They had early diesels that they had bought in the 40s and 50s that were being supplanted by early 1960s turbocharged, what were called second generation diesels. And freight cars were the same way. You still had a lot of old equipment that went back in the 1930s. It was still cars that were constructed completely out of wood, and yet you had ultra-modern cars that were longer and held more stuff. It was a traffic peak for the railroad, only surpassed by World War II. I'm planning to run every single train that ran through here in 1964, including all 6 passenger trains. There were 17 scheduled movements, and although the timetable does show a movement for a particular train, that could be more than one train, which is something else I'm researching. Some of the local trains ran in 2 or 3 sections, which means 2 or 3 different trains came through, and they'd all follow each other and run as different pieces of it because the train was too long to run in one piece. They'd get up to Santa Barbara and they'd split the train in 2. The coastline is actually a mountain railroad. It runs up and down the hills as it goes up and down up the coast. They had to cut the trains down a little bit. They'd have a train that maybe had 150 cars and they'd cut it into 75 car trains, but they'd run that as the same train. They'd have engines assigned as a second section of it. Trains going the other way couldn't get between those 2 sections, so if a train was waiting on the siding for 2 sections of a train, both sections had to come by before it could run the other way. More complications, switching of cars, scheduling things that would be a nightmare for the real railroad are all more fun for somebody operating a model railroad. There aren't many people modeling it, like the coastline part, because it's not very accessible. And the thing about this line is most of the stuff looked exactly the same back then. The scenery was exactly the same. It's the same now. You go out to Gaviota and it's still the trestle, it's still the beach, it's the same as you look at a picture of it from 1937 on, the trestle is exactly the same. The idea is to have this thing look like the area I'm modeling, so that people can come in here and recognize that it looks like that, have the trains look like the trains that ran during that time, and most importantly, and this is the part I'm still putting together, have them behave and operated as close to that as possible. I've already done a lot of the research for the equipment and for the line itself. I've done a pretty fair job of modeling the trains to look the way they did and the scenery to look the way it did. But the big piece is getting it all to work the way that it did. And that's not only mechanically getting the engines to work right and the cars to stay on the track, but to get the information. You can go out and take pictures of the railroad and the cars and everything from that era and get the idea for the first two parts, but the third part, you have to talk to people and you have to be able to have some knowledge of what the railroads really did. And this line was somewhat unique because of its location and the operating conditions it had, being right along the ocean. What was done at the stations, where the trains were rescheduled often, cars that were brought in and brought out of different places like Lompoc, what the traffic flow was, things that went wrong, like track washouts or slow orders somewhere for something or another, or seasonal things like sugar beets. Sugar beets were a seasonal cargo. It involved, maybe a couple hundred more cars that would go through there on a particular day, when the season was at its peak. There's all kinds of great information out there, and it's just you got to find the people that have it, and I'm sure most of them would be glad to tell you about the things they encountered on them. In fact, I have one guy I talked to that worked on the Lompoc branch in 1965, and he gives me great insight on the stuff. The tracks and surf actually had names for them, for the different functions that they had. And I have one friend that understands signaling inside and out, and he tells me all these great little things about how the signals worked and what they did, and it's some people would look at that and think it'd be just like going back to school again and it'd be drudgery, but for someone that's into this thing, it's all fun finding out these things. It's like a little mystery where you find out clues. It's just a matter of uncovering the things.